Something happened on a Friday afternoon in Jerusalem that the world has never been able to fully explain. It was not the execution itself. Rome had crucified thousands before and would crucify thousands after. The empire had perfected the art of public death. Every province had its crosses. Every roadside had its warnings. The machinery of state violence was efficient, practiced, and utterly indifferent to the individuals it consumed. But this execution was different, not because of what the authorities did. They followed their procedures: the trial, the sentencing, the procession to the hill, the nails, the cross, the slow hours of suffocation and agony. All of this was routine, a day's work, an entry in the ledger. What was not routine was what happened next, because the moment this man died, the world reacted. Not the human world, not the crowd gathered at the foot of the cross, though they reacted too. The physical world, the earth itself, the sky, the stone beneath people's feet, the fabric hanging inside the most sacred building in the city, the sealed chambers where the dead had been laid to rest. 5 things happened in rapid succession, things that did not belong to the ordinary course of nature, things that could not be explained by the circumstances of a criminal execution, things that left the witnesses shaken in a way that the crucifixion alone never could have. The sky went dark, the earth shook, the rocks split open, a curtain tore in two, and the tombs opened. Each of these events, taken alone, might have been dismissed. An unusual weather pattern, a seismic tremor, a structural failure in the temple, a rock slide near the burial grounds. Any single one of them could have been filed away as coincidence. But they did not happen alone. They happened together, at the same moment, in direct response, or so it seemed to every witness present, to the death of a single man on a Roman cross. This is the story of those 5 events, not as theological abstractions, not as articles of faith to be accepted or rejected, but as experiences, as moments that real people lived through on a real afternoon in a real city under a sky that should not have been dark. We are going to move through them slowly, one by one, not because the events themselves were slow, most of them happened in seconds, but because understanding them requires patience, requires sitting with each one, requires asking not just what happened, but what it felt like to be there when it did. Because the people who stood on that hill, who watched the darkness fall, who felt the ground move beneath their feet, those people were not reading a theological text. They were not debating doctrine. They were standing in the open air, in the middle of the day, watching a man die. And then the world broke open around them. To understand what those 5 events meant to the people who witnessed them, you need to stand where they stood. You need to feel the heat of the afternoon sun on your neck, smell the dust that rose from the unpaved roads, hear the overlapping voices of a city swollen to several times its normal population. Jerusalem during Passover was not a quiet place. The city's normal population of perhaps 40 or 50,000 expanded to something closer to 300,000. Some ancient sources claimed even more. The narrow streets, designed for a fraction of that number, became rivers of humanity. Pilgrims arrived from every direction, from the Galilee in the north, from the coastal cities of the west, from the Jewish communities scattered across the empire in Alexandria, Antioch, Rome itself. They came to remember. Passover was the festival of liberation, the annual retelling of the story in which an enslaved people walked free from the most powerful empire of their age. Every family gathered around a table, ate the prescribed foods, and told their children the ancient words, "We were slaves, and now we are not." The preparations began days in advance. Lambs were selected and inspected. Unleavened bread was baked. The houses were searched room by room, corner by corner, for any trace of leaven, ordinary bread, which had to be removed before the festival could begin. This was not merely a cultural tradition, it was a reenactment, a physical, sensory experience designed to make each generation feel as though they themselves had walked out of Egypt. The smell of roasting lamb filled every street as evening approached. The smoke from thousands of cooking fires rose above the city like a low cloud, visible from the surrounding hills. The temple itself was the center of the sacrifice. The Passover lambs were brought to the priests, who performed the ritual slaughter in the temple courts, and the blood was poured at the base of the altar. The scale of this was staggering. Ancient sources suggest that tens of thousands of lambs were sacrificed in a single afternoon. The blood ran through channels cut into the temple floor and was flushed away with water. But those who were present described the air as heavy with the smell of it. This was the atmosphere in which the events of that week unfolded. Not a calm, scholarly setting, not a peaceful countryside, but a city vibrating with memory, crowded beyond capacity, saturated with religious intensity, and overseen by an occupying army that trusted nothing and no one. The irony was inescapable. A celebration of freedom observed under military occupation. Roman soldiers patrolled the temple courts. Roman tax collectors sat at the city gates. A Roman governor occupied the former palace of the Jewish kings, looking down on the crowds from a terrace designed to project authority and control. The tension was always present during Passover. The memories the festival invoked, divine intervention, the fall of oppressors, the liberation of a captive people, were precisely the kind of memories that made empires nervous. Every year, the Roman governor left his comfortable headquarters on the coast and marched to Jerusalem with additional troops, specifically to prevent the festival from becoming a flashpoint. This year, something had already gone wrong. A preacher from the northern province of Galilee had entered the city earlier in the week in a manner that was unmistakably provocative. He rode a donkey, a deliberate echo of an ancient prophecy about a coming king. Crowds had lined the roads, waving palm branches, shouting words of messianic expectation. The authorities had noticed. Both the Roman administration and the Jewish religious leadership had taken note. Within days, this man, Jesus of Nazareth, had confronted the temple establishment directly, overturning the tables of the money changers in the outer courts, accusing the religious leadership of corruption in their own sacred space. The reaction was swift. Secret meetings were held. A plan was formed. One of his own followers was persuaded to reveal his location. The arrest came at night, in a garden on the slopes of the Mount of Olives. The trial was held before dawn, in violation of normal legal procedures. By morning, the prisoner had been handed over to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, with a demand for execution. What followed was the kind of event that Rome had engineered to be as public, as painful, and as humiliating as possible. The scourging came first. A Roman flagellum, a whip with multiple leather strands, each tipped with bone or metal, was designed to tear flesh from the body in strips. Many prisoners did not survive the scourging. It was a punishment in its own right, sometimes delivered instead of execution. In this case, it was merely the prelude. Then the procession. The condemned man was forced to carry the horizontal beam of his own cross through the streets of the city, past the same crowds that had welcomed him days earlier. The route was public by design. Every step was a message from the empire to its subjects. This is what happens to those who dream of other kingdoms. The execution site was a rocky outcropping just outside the city walls, close enough to the main road that passers-by could not avoid seeing what was happening. The place was called Golgotha in the local language, the place of the skull. Whether it was named for its shape or its function, the name itself carried a weight that needed no explanation. 3 crosses were raised that afternoon, 2 ordinary criminals on either side, and in the center, the man from Galilee. It was around noon, the 6th hour by the local reckoning, when the first of the 5 events began, and everything changed. The sun was directly overhead. It was the brightest part of the day. There were no storm clouds, no weather systems moving in from the coast. The sky had been clear all morning, the way it usually was in this part of the world during the spring festival season. And then the light began to fail. It did not happen all at once. It was not like a candle being blown out. It was gradual, almost imperceptible at first, like the slow closing of an eye. The brightness of the noon sun softened. The shadows on the ground grew less distinct. The colors of the landscape, the gold of the limestone walls, the green of the olive trees, the white of the pilgrim's clothing, began to drain away, as if someone were slowly turning down the intensity of the world itself. People looked up, not in alarm at first, in confusion. The sky was doing something it should not have been doing. The sun was still there. It had not disappeared behind a cloud, because there were no clouds, but its light was diminishing, weakening, retreating. Within minutes, the city was in twilight, and then it grew darker still. The merchants in the market stalls paused. The women carrying water jars stopped mid-step. The children who had been playing in the dusty alleyways grew quiet. The animals, the donkeys, the goats, the doves in their cages, became restless. Roosters crowed, confused by the darkness, into thinking that night had come hours early. On the hill, the crowd around the crosses changed. The mockers who had been shouting insults fell silent. The religious leaders who had come to witness the completion of their plan shifted uneasily on their feet. The women who had been weeping drew closer together, and the soldiers, the Roman soldiers who had carried out hundreds of crucifixions and prided themselves on their professional detachment, found themselves glancing at the sky, then at each other, with an uncertainty they could not quite conceal. The ancient texts describe this as darkness over the whole land. The word used could mean the entire region of Judea, or it could mean the whole earth. The writers themselves may not have known the extent. What they knew was what they saw. The sky went dark in the middle of the day, and it stayed dark for 3 hours. 3 hours. Not a brief shadow, not a passing phenomenon. 3 sustained hours of unnatural darkness, beginning at noon and lasting until the middle of the afternoon. To put this in perspective, 3 hours is long enough for a person to walk from one end of Jerusalem to the other and back again. 3 hours is long enough for the entire afternoon sacrifice in the temple to be completed. 3 hours is long enough for the mind to move through confusion into fear, through fear into numbness, and out of numbness into a quiet, trembling awareness that something beyond ordinary experience is taking place. In the modern world, the first instinct is to search for a natural explanation. A solar eclipse is the most commonly proposed, but the timing makes this impossible. Passover was celebrated at full moon, and solar eclipses can only occur during a new moon. The orbital mechanics do not allow both to happen simultaneously. Whatever caused the darkness, it was not an eclipse. Volcanic ash has been suggested, unusual atmospheric conditions, a Khamsin dust storm. Each of these has been proposed, examined, and found insufficient to explain the specific characteristics described by the witnesses, the duration, the completeness of the darkness, and its sudden onset and conclusion. But for the people standing on the hill that afternoon, the cause was less important than the experience. The darkness was not simply visual, it was physical. Witnesses described a heaviness in the air, as if the atmosphere itself had thickened. Sounds became muted, the temperature dropped. The normal sensory experience of a Mediterranean afternoon, the heat, the brightness, the clarity of the light, was replaced by something oppressive and disorienting. People standing a few yards apart could barely see each other. The crosses on the hill became dark silhouettes. The crowd, which had been loud and active, mocking, weeping, arguing, fell quiet. The darkness imposed its own silence. In the ancient world, darkness at midday was not merely unusual, it was terrifying. It was understood as a cosmic sign. The prophets had written about it. Amos, centuries earlier, had described a day of the Lord in which the sun would go down at noon and the earth would be darkened in broad daylight. These were not weather forecasts. They were descriptions of divine judgment, of moments when the boundary between the ordinary world and the divine realm became thin. For the Jewish observers present, this darkness was not random. It was language, a language they had been trained to read since childhood, and what it said was unmistakable. Something of ultimate significance is happening. For 3 hours, the darkness held. During those hours, the man on the central cross was still alive. The accounts tell us that he spoke several times. His words were sparse, broken by the physical agony of the crucifixion, but those who stood close enough to hear remembered every one of them. And then, near the end of the 3 hours, he cried out, a loud voice, a sentence drawn from an ancient psalm, a prayer of anguish, of abandonment, of a soul in extremity reaching toward a God who seems absent. Shortly after that cry, he died, and the darkness began to lift. But what replaced it was not ordinary daylight. What replaced it was an earthquake. The timing was precise enough that every witness noticed it. The moment the man on the cross breathed his last, the ground moved. Not gently, not subtly, not in a way that could be mistaken for something else. The earth shook. The Hebrew word used in the earliest accounts carries the sense of a violent shaking, a convulsion. This was not a mild tremor. It was the kind of seismic event that makes people lose their footing, that sends loose stones tumbling down hillsides, that causes buildings to groan and shift on their foundations. The Judean hills sit along a significant fault line. The Jordan Rift Valley, which runs from the Dead Sea northward through the Sea of Galilee and beyond, is one of the most geologically active zones in the region. Earthquakes were not unknown in ancient Jerusalem. The people who lived there had felt the ground move before. But not like this, not at this exact moment. The coincidence, if it was a coincidence, was impossible to ignore. A man dies on a cross, and at the precise instant of his death, the earth beneath the city convulses. The timing was not approximate, it was simultaneous, as if the death and the earthquake were not two separate events, but a single event experienced in two different ways. For the Roman soldiers stationed at the execution site, earthquakes were simply earthquakes. They had no framework for reading cosmic signs in geological events. Their world was practical, material, organized around discipline and force. And yet even they were shaken. Not just physically, but something deeper. The combination of the darkness and the earthquake, occurring in such precise conjunction with the death they had just administered, was enough to unsettle men who were trained to be unsettled by nothing. One of them, a centurion, meaning a career officer responsible for 100 men, said something remarkable. He had overseen the crucifixion from start to finish. He had watched the darkness fall and the earth shake, and now, standing amid the settling dust, he spoke a sentence that would be remembered for millennia. He did not say it as a theologian. He did not say it as a believer. He said it as a witness. Truly, this man was the Son of God. The sentence stands in the text without commentary or explanation. It is simply reported. A Roman military officer, at the scene of an execution he supervised, making a statement that overturned every assumption he had carried into that day.
What drove him to say it, we do not know exactly, but we can reconstruct what he had experienced in the preceding hours. He had watched the sky darken at noon without explanation. He had felt the ground convulse beneath his feet at the exact moment the prisoner died. He had heard the rocks crack around him. He had seen, perhaps, the dust rising from the fractures, the stones tumbling from the hillside. And he had watched a man die, not with the cursing and screaming that usually accompanied crucifixion, but with words that sounded like prayer. This centurion had probably watched hundreds of men die. He knew what death looked like. He knew the sounds, the smells, the stages of deterioration. Nothing in his professional experience had prepared him for this. Not the death itself, which was ordinary enough in its mechanics, but the response of the world to the death, as if creation itself was mourning, as if the earth was acknowledging something that the humans around it had failed to recognize. His words were not a conversion, they were a confession.
forced out of him not by argument, but by experience, by the accumulated weight of everything he had seen and felt in those 3 hours of darkness and the earthquake that followed. And he was not the only one affected. The other soldiers who were present, the text tells us, were terrified. Not merely startled by the earthquake, terrified. These were trained military professionals, men who faced combat, who maintained order in hostile provinces, who prided themselves on discipline and control, and they were afraid. Meanwhile, the earthquake had done something else, something that the people in the city would not discover until later. But those who were near the rocky outcroppings around the execution site saw it immediately. The earthquake was not merely felt, it was visible. The limestone formations around Jerusalem, the same rock from which the city's walls and buildings were constructed, the same rock into which tombs were carved and cisterns were cut, cracked open. Not along existing fault lines only, but in new places. Fresh fractures appeared in stone that had been solid and unchanging for as long as anyone could remember. The text uses a specific word. The rocks were split, not worn, not eroded, split, as if by a sudden, deliberate force applied from within. For the people who witnessed this, the splitting of the rocks was not merely geological, it was symbolic. In the Hebrew prophetic tradition, the splitting of rock carried deep associations. When Moses struck the rock in the wilderness, water flowed out to sustain a dying people. When God appeared on Mount Sinai, the mountain shook and the rocks trembled. The splitting of stone was connected, in the collective memory, with moments of divine manifestation. Rock in the ancient world represented permanence, stability, the unchangeable order of things. When rock split, it meant that the unchangeable was being changed, that the foundations of the world were responding to something that transcended the normal operations of nature. The fractures in the stone around Golgotha were not minor surface cracks. The accounts describe them as deep, significant breaks. Some of these fractures can arguably still be seen today beneath the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, though the layers of construction and reconstruction over 2 millennia make certainty impossible. What is certain is that the witnesses remembered this detail with precision. Of all the things that happened that afternoon, the splitting of the rocks was one of the most visceral, because you could touch it. You could put your hand into the crack. You could feel the ragged edge of the break and know that this stone, which had been whole that morning, was now broken. And the breaking had happened at the exact moment a man died. The rocks did not split before the death. They did not split after the earthquake subsided. They split when the earth shook, which happened when the man breathed his last. The chain of causation, or correlation, was clear to everyone present. Whether they interpreted it as divine response or natural coincidence, the sequence was undeniable. Something was connected, something was linked, and the links were about to multiply. While the earth shook on the hill outside the city, something happened inside the city that only a few people witnessed directly. But those who did witness it were among the most important and most credible observers in Jerusalem, the priests. The Temple of Jerusalem was not merely a building, it was the center of the universe as far as the Jewish people were concerned. The place where heaven and earth met, the place where the presence of God was understood to dwell, not symbolically, not metaphorically, but actually. The divine glory, which had once filled the tabernacle in the wilderness and later the temple built by Solomon, was believed to reside in the innermost chamber of this building. That chamber was called the Holy of Holies. It was a cube-shaped room, roughly 30 feet in every dimension, empty as far as anyone knew. The Ark of the Covenant, which had once stood there, had been lost centuries earlier, disappeared during the Babylonian destruction of the first temple, and never recovered. But the emptiness was not understood as absence. It was understood as pure presence, too pure for human contact, too holy for human eyes. The empty space was filled, in the theological imagination, with the weight of God's own being. The rabbis taught that the world itself was sustained from this room, that creation radiated outward from this single point, that if the Holy of Holies were ever to be violated, the consequences would be not merely religious, but cosmic. Only one person was permitted to enter the Holy of Holies, the high priest, and he could only enter once a year, on the Day of Atonement, after elaborate rituals of purification that took an entire week. He would bathe multiple times. He would change his garments. He would make sacrifices for his own sins before he could even approach the threshold. According to tradition, a rope was tied around his ankle before he entered, so that if he died in the presence of God, his body could be pulled out without anyone else having to enter. The seriousness of this cannot be overstated. This was not a symbolic boundary. In the minds of every person in that city, this was the most dangerous threshold in existence. To cross it without authorization was not merely a crime, it was a death sentence, delivered not by human hands, but by the divine presence itself. The boundary between the outer sanctuary and the Holy of Holies was not a wall, it was a curtain. But calling it a curtain vastly understates what it was. The ancient sources describe it as a massive, heavy piece of woven fabric. Tradition says it was a handbreadth thick, roughly 4 inches of densely woven material. It was as tall as the temple itself, perhaps 60 feet high. It was so heavy that, according to the Talmud, it required 300 priests to handle during its periodic replacement. It was woven in blue, purple, and scarlet, and its surface was embroidered with images of the heavens, cherubim, the angelic guardians of the divine presence. This curtain was the most important boundary in the Jewish religious world. It was the line between the accessible and the inaccessible, between the human realm and the divine presence, between the ordinary and the holy beyond comprehension. And at the moment of the earthquake, it tore, from top to bottom. This detail is critical, the direction of the tear. It did not begin at the bottom, where human hands might have reached. It began at the top, far above any person's reach, and ripped downward, as if an invisible hand had gripped the upper edge and pulled. The fabric, which had been one continuous barrier, was now 2 pieces hanging uselessly on either side. The space behind it was exposed. The Holy of Holies, the most restricted, most protected, most sacred space in the entire religious system, was now open. Open to the air, open to the light, open to anyone who looked. The priests who were serving in the temple at that moment, performing the afternoon rituals, burning incense, maintaining the fires, were the first to see it. And what they saw must have shaken them to their core, because the curtain was not merely a piece of fabric, it was the physical embodiment of a theological principle. The principle that God is separate, that holiness requires distance, that the divine presence cannot be approached directly by impure, mortal, ordinary human beings. And now that principle was hanging in two torn pieces. What did it mean? For the priests, trained in a system built around boundaries and restrictions and careful separations between the holy and the common, this was not merely alarming, it was category-shattering. The entire structure of their religious world depended on the integrity of that boundary. And the boundary had just been destroyed, not by a human hand, not by accident, not by neglect or decay,
but by a force that came from above and tore downward at the exact moment when a man died on a cross outside the city walls. The connection, for those with eyes to see it, was staggering. The barrier between God and humanity had been removed, not partially, not symbolically, completely. The earthquake did more than split rocks and shake buildings. It did something that pushed the events of that afternoon beyond the boundaries of natural explanation entirely. The tombs around Jerusalem opened. The city was surrounded by burial sites. Rock-cut tombs dotted the hillsides, their entrances sealed with heavy stones, their interiors holding the remains of the dead. These were not casual burials. Each tomb represented a family's investment, a community's care, and, most importantly, a permanent separation between the living and the dead. In the ancient world, the boundary between life and death was absolute. The dead were gone. Their world and the world of the living did not intersect. Tombs were sealed not merely for hygiene or respect, but as a statement of finality. The stone in front of the tomb was a period at the end of a sentence. The story of that life was complete. And now the stones had moved. The seismic force of the earthquake shifted the heavy rolling stones that covered the tomb entrances. In some cases, the stones simply slid partially aside. In others, they appeared to have been dislodged entirely. The dark interiors of the burial chambers were exposed to daylight for the first time since the bodies inside had been laid to rest. This alone would have been disturbing enough. The violation of the tomb, the breaking of that seal between the living and the dead, was deeply unsettling in a culture that took burial practices with profound seriousness. The dead were meant to remain undisturbed. Their rest was sacrosanct. But what the accounts describe went further, much further. The text says that the bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs, and after the resurrection of Jesus, they went into the holy city and appeared to many people. This passage is one of the most extraordinary and least discussed in the entire New Testament. It is reported almost casually, in a single sentence, tucked between the description of the earthquake and the centurion's response. It is not elaborated upon. It is not explained. It is simply stated as if the writer knew that any amount of explanation would be inadequate. People who had been dead came back to life. They emerged from their tombs. They entered the city. They were seen by many. The text uses the word many, not one or two isolated sightings, but multiple encounters, witnessed by multiple people in the city of Jerusalem itself. These were not visions seen by a single mystic in a moment of ecstasy. They were public appearances in a crowded city during the busiest festival of the year. The questions this raises are almost too numerous to count. Who were these people?
The text calls them holy people, saints in the traditional translation. This suggests they were not ordinary individuals, but people who had been recognized in their lifetimes for their devotion, their wisdom, or their prophetic gifts. How long had they been dead? The text does not specify. Some interpreters have suggested years, others generations. Did they speak? Did their families recognize them? How did they appear? In their burial wrappings or in ordinary clothing? Were they solid, tangible, capable of being touched? How long did this last? Where did they go afterward? The text answers none of these questions. But the silence is not dismissive. It is the silence of awe, the silence of a writer who knows that what he is describing exceeds the capacity of his language, who sets down the bare fact, the dead appeared among the living, and then moves on, because there is nothing he can add that would make it more comprehensible. The people of Jerusalem who encountered these figures did not have the luxury of theological reflection. They were standing in a street, or sitting in a courtyard, or walking through a marketplace, when they saw a face they had not expected to see again in this life. The shock was not intellectual. It was visceral, physical. The kind of shock that makes the blood drain from your face and your knees weaken. Imagine seeing your grandfather in a crowd. Not someone who resembles your grandfather. Your grandfather. The man who was buried 3 years ago, whose tomb you helped seal, whose absence you have slowly, painfully learned to live with. Standing there, looking at you, present. That is what these accounts describe. Not a vision, not a dream, a presence, a body, a face. The people who experienced these encounters did not react with celebration or joy. They reacted with shock, with awe, with a trembling that went deeper than fear, into a place where the fundamental rules of existence had been violated, and no one knew what the new rules were. The appearances were not public spectacles. They were personal encounters. A figure recognized on a street corner, a face seen in a crowd that should not have been there, a presence felt in a room that triggered a memory so old it had almost been forgotten. These encounters were brief, they were quiet, and they left the living more shaken than any earthquake could, because the earthquake only moved the ground. This moved reality itself. As the sun began to set on that extraordinary afternoon, a more immediate and practical matter demanded attention. The body on the central cross needed to be removed before the Sabbath began at sundown. Jewish law was clear on this point. A body could not be left hanging overnight, and the approaching holy day added additional urgency. 2 men stepped forward who had not been visible in the events of the day. They had not stood in the crowd at the foot of the cross. They had not been among the vocal followers or the vocal opponents. They had been hidden, positioned in the spaces between the factions, watching and waiting for a moment that required their specific resources. Joseph of Arimathea was a member of the Jewish ruling council, the Sanhedrin, the same body that had condemned Jesus to death hours earlier. But Joseph had not consented to the decision. He had disagreed silently, unwilling or unable to stop the proceedings, but refusing to add his voice to the verdict. He was wealthy. He owned property near the execution site, and he had recently commissioned a new tomb carved from solid rock which had never been used. The second man was Nicodemus. He too was a member of the religious elite, a Pharisee who had once come to Jesus at night under cover of darkness, to ask questions that he could not ask publicly. He brought with him a staggering quantity of burial spices, myrrh and aloe, nearly 75 pounds of them. This was not an ordinary burial preparation. This was the kind of lavish treatment reserved for royalty. Together, these two men took the body down from the cross. The physical reality of this moment is often passed over in the telling, but it deserves attention. The body was real. It was heavy. It bore the marks of everything that had been done to it: the scourging, the thorns, the nails, the spear wound in the side. The blood had dried. The skin was torn. The damage was extensive and unmistakable. This was not a man who had fainted. This was not a man who might recover with rest and medical care. This was a body that had been destroyed by one of the most effective execution methods ever devised. They wrapped the body in clean linen. They placed the spices between the layers of fabric. They carried it to Joseph's garden tomb, a short distance from the execution site. They laid it on the stone shelf inside, and then they rolled the heavy circular stone across the entrance. The sound of that stone sliding into place, the deep, grinding scrape of rock against rock, was the sound of finality, of a story ending, of a chapter closing. But the story was not over. The following morning, the religious authorities went to Pilate with a concern. They remembered, they said, that this man had claimed he would rise after 3 days. They feared the disciples might steal the body and then claim a resurrection. They requested guards for the tomb. Pilate granted the request. Roman soldiers were dispatched. The tomb was sealed with an official seal, a mark pressed into wax or clay that crossed the junction between the stone and the rock face. Breaking this seal was a crime against Rome itself. The guards took their positions. The message was clear. This tomb was not merely closed, it was locked, sealed, guarded, and backed by the full authority of the Roman Empire. Nothing was getting in, and nothing was getting out. And then came Saturday, the Sabbath, the day of rest, the day when Jewish law forbade work, travel, and activity, the day when the city, swollen with pilgrims and buzzing with the aftershocks of the previous day's events, was forced into stillness. For the followers of Jesus, this was the darkest day of all. Friday had at least contained action, movement, events to witness, decisions to make, a body to bury. The horror of the crucifixion was at least something happening, something the mind could engage with, even if it could not understand. Saturday had nothing, only silence, only the sealed tomb and the Roman guards and the unanswered questions. The disciples had scattered. They were hiding in rented rooms behind locked doors, afraid that the same authorities who had executed their teacher would come for them next. They did not gather in large groups. They did not pray publicly. They did not organize or plan. They simply survived, minute by minute, in a state of shock so deep that it resembled numbness more than grief. Everything they had believed was in question. Every miracle they had witnessed, every teaching they had absorbed, every promise they had heard. All of it now lay behind a sealed stone, guarded by Roman soldiers, in a tomb borrowed from a rich man. Some of them had abandoned their homes, their families, their livelihoods to follow this man. They had staked their entire lives on the belief that he was the one the prophets had foretold. And now he was dead, not peacefully in his bed surrounded by followers, violently publicly, shamefully, on a Roman cross. Peter, the most prominent of the disciples, carried a specific burden that day. In the hours before the crucifixion, he had been confronted 3 times by bystanders who recognized him as a follower of Jesus. 3 times he denied it. The last denial was vehement. He cursed and swore that he had never known the man. And at that moment, as one account records, Jesus turned and looked at him. Just looked. And Peter went out and wept bitterly. Now, on Saturday, that memory was inescapable. The grief was not only for the loss of his teacher, it was for the loss of himself. The person he thought he was, loyal, brave, willing to die, had been revealed as a fiction. He had failed at the moment when it mattered most, and the person he had failed could no longer forgive him, because that person was dead. The other disciples carried their own versions of this weight. They had all fled. Every single one of them, at the moment of arrest, had abandoned the man they had followed for 3 years. The memory of that abandonment sat like a stone in their stomachs throughout the long, empty hours of Saturday. And behind the personal grief, there was a larger despair. The hopes of Israel, the ancient, burning, persistent hope that God would send a deliverer, a king, a Messiah who would restore the nation and establish justice on the earth. Those hopes now appeared to have been extinguished. Not gradually, not through the slow erosion of disappointment, but violently in a single afternoon on a Roman cross. The women who had followed Jesus, who had been present at the crucifixion when most of the male disciples had fled, spent the Sabbath in quiet preparation. They could not visit the tomb until the Sabbath ended, but they gathered spices and ointments, planning to return at the earliest possible moment to complete the burial rites that had been rushed the evening before. Their devotion was practical, not mystical. They did not expect miracles. They expected a body. They expected grief. They expected the painful, necessary work of honoring the dead. In the temple, the priests continued their services. The curtain that had torn, that massive, thick barrier between the ordinary world and the holiest space in existence, was a problem that needed to be managed. How they dealt with it, the texts do not say. Perhaps they tried to repair it. Perhaps they hung a temporary replacement. Perhaps they simply worked around it, pretending that the boundary still existed, even though everyone could see it did not. The city itself was quiet. The festival continued. Families gathered for the remaining days of Passover observance. But beneath the surface routine, the events of Friday pulsed like a wound that had not yet been treated. The darkness, the earthquake, the torn curtain, the opened tombs. Each of these was being discussed, interpreted, debated, and denied in homes and courtyards throughout the city. In the homes of the religious leaders, the mood was different, but equally uneasy. They had accomplished what they set out to do. The troublesome preacher was dead. The movement was decapitated. The threat to their authority had been removed. And yet, the manner of the death had not brought the relief they expected. The signs that accompanied it, the darkness, the earthquake, the torn curtain in their own temple, were not the markers of a successful operation. They were the markers of something they could not control and did not understand. Some of them, perhaps, lay awake that Saturday night, turning over the events in their minds.
The curtain had torn from top to bottom, not from bottom to top. The direction mattered. It meant the tearing had not come from below, from the human realm. It had come from above, from the side where God was supposed to dwell. And if God had torn the curtain, then the religious leadership had not eliminated a threat. They had participated in something far larger and more terrible than they had imagined. But these were thoughts that could not be spoken aloud, not on the Sabbath, not in the corridors of power, not by men whose authority depended on the assumption that they understood the will of God. In the streets, the ordinary people of Jerusalem, those who had no stake in the politics of crucifixion, who had simply been going about their lives when the sky went dark and the ground shook, carried their own version of Saturday's weight. They did not know the theological significance of the torn curtain. They did not know about the opened tombs unless rumors had reached them. But they knew the darkness, they knew the earthquake, and they knew, in the way that ordinary people always know, that something had changed. The conversations were hushed. The marketplace whispers were cautious. Everyone had a theory, but no one had certainty. And in the absence of certainty, the imagination fills the space with its own fears and hopes. The tomb remained sealed. The guards remained at their posts. The stone did not move. The hours of Saturday crawled past. The shadows lengthened. The sun set. The stars appeared. The same stars that had appeared every night since creation, indifferent to the events below. The night deepened. And somewhere in that darkness, between the end of Saturday and the first light of Sunday, the world changed. No one saw it happen. No one heard it. But when the women arrived at the tomb before dawn, what they found was not what they had left. Saturday passed, and the world held its breath. The first day of the week began before the sun rose. Several women, the accounts vary in the exact number, but they agree on the core group, set out in the pre-dawn darkness, carrying the spices and ointments they had prepared. Their mission was simple. Their expectation was clear. They were going to finish preparing the body for permanent burial. Their only concern was practical. The stone was massive. Who would roll it away for them? They did not have the strength to move it themselves. They had no plan for this problem. They simply walked toward it, driven by love and duty and the refusal to leave their teacher's body in an incomplete state of burial. The walk was quiet. The city was still sleeping. Their sandals made soft sounds on the stone paths. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, the first pale gray of dawn appearing on the horizon, but the stars were still visible overhead. When they reached the garden, they stopped. The stone was not in place. The entrance to the tomb was open. The heavy disk of rock that had been rolled across the opening, sealed with a Roman seal and guarded by armed soldiers, was no longer covering the entrance. It had been moved aside. The dark interior of the tomb was exposed. The guards were gone. The seal was broken, and inside the tomb, the body was not there. The linen wrappings were present, lying on the stone shelf where the body had been placed. But they were not scattered or thrown aside, as they would have been if someone had hastily unwrapped the body to steal it. They were lying in place, as if the body had simply passed through them. The cloth that had been around the head was folded separately, placed to one side with a deliberateness that suggested intention, not haste. This detail about the folded cloth is small but significant.
If someone had come to steal the body, if the disciples had somehow overpowered armed guards, broken a Roman seal, and removed the body in the dark, they would not have paused to fold the facecloth neatly and set it aside. Grave robbers do not practice hospitality. Thieves do not leave things tidy. The orderliness of the scene suggested not theft, but departure, as if the person who had been lying there had simply gotten up, left the wrappings behind, and walked out.
But who would have done such a thing, and how? The body had been dead for more than 36 hours. The injuries were fatal by any standard. The burial had been confirmed by multiple witnesses. The tomb had been sealed, guarded, and placed under the authority of the Roman state. And yet it was empty. What happened next, in those first bewildering moments at the open tomb, was not a single coherent narrative. It was a collision of shock, fear, confusion, and the first trembling hint of something that no one dared to name. Different accounts preserve different details. Angels, a young man in white, two figures, a voice, a message. But the core of the message was the same across every telling. He is not here. He has risen. The women did not respond with faith. They responded with terror. They trembled. They ran. In one account, they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. This is not a behavior of people who expected this. This is not the reaction of a group executing a carefully planned deception. This is the raw, unfiltered response of human beings encountering something that exceeded every category they possessed. The news reached the disciples in fragments, breathless women arriving at the locked door, sentences tumbling over each other, half-finished, contradictory. Peter and another disciple ran to the tomb to see for themselves. They found it exactly as the women had described, open, empty, the linens lying in place. They looked, they saw, and they went home, the text says, wondering what had happened, not believing, wondering. The belief came later, and it came not through the empty tomb alone, but through the encounters that followed. And then, in the hours and days that followed, the encounters began. The first was in the garden itself. Mary Magdalene, who had been among the women at the tomb, remained behind after the others had left. She stood outside the tomb, weeping. Through her tears, she looked inside and saw two figures in white, seated where the body had been, one at the head, one at the feet. They asked her why she was crying. She told them, "Someone has taken my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." Then she turned around. A man was standing behind her. She did not recognize him. The grief, the tears, the early morning light, the impossibility of what she was experiencing, all of it obscured her perception. She assumed he was the gardener, the caretaker of this private garden. She asked him, almost desperately, if he had moved the body. "If you have carried him away, tell me where, and I will take him." One word changed everything. He said her name, Mary, and in that single word, spoken in a voice she had heard 1,000 times, with an inflection that no stranger could have known, she recognized him. The grief broke. The confusion dissolved. She turned fully toward him and cried out a single word in her own language, "Rabboni," teacher.
This scene, a woman weeping in a garden at dawn, a moment of recognition triggered not by sight, but by the sound of her own name, is one of the most intimate moments in all of ancient literature. It is not a public demonstration. It is not a display of power. It is a personal reunion. And it establishes a pattern that all the subsequent appearances would follow. The recognition does not come through evidence. It comes through relationship. Later that same day, 2 followers were walking to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were deep in conversation, trying to make sense of the events of the past 3 days. A stranger joined them on the road. He asked what they were discussing. They were astonished. "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know what has happened?" The stranger walked with them for hours. He talked about the scriptures. He explained the ancient texts in a way they had never heard before, showing how the prophets had spoken of a Messiah who would suffer and die before entering his glory. Their hearts burned within them as he spoke, they later recalled. And yet, they did not recognize him. Only when they reached the village and sat down to eat, and he took the bread and blessed it and broke it, only in that ordinary domestic gesture did their eyes open. And then he vanished. They looked at each other across the table, the broken bread still in their hands, and said, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked to us on the road?" They got up immediately, despite the late hour, despite the distance, and ran back to Jerusalem. That same evening, the disciples were gathered in a locked room. The doors were shut, the windows were covered. They were afraid that the authorities who had killed their teacher would come for them. And suddenly, without any door opening, without any sound of approach, he was standing among them. "Peace be with you," he said. He showed them his hands and his side. The wounds were still there, real, tangible, not the wounds of a ghost or an apparition, but the physical marks of nails and a spear, present on a body that could apparently pass through locked doors. Thomas was not present that evening. When the others told him what had happened, he refused to believe. His response was not hostile, it was honest. "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." A week later, the opportunity was given, and Thomas, confronted with the evidence he had demanded, did not analyze it or debate it. He simply said, "My Lord and my God." The last recorded appearance is perhaps the most tender. Several of the disciples had returned to Galilee, to the lake where some of them had been fishermen before they ever heard the name Jesus. Peter, restless and perhaps still carrying the weight of his threefold denial, announced that he was going fishing. The others joined him. They fished all night and caught nothing. At dawn, a figure appeared on the shore. He called out to them across the water, telling them to cast their net on the other side of the boat. They did. The net filled so heavily they could barely haul it in. One of them recognized the pattern. It had happened before, years ago, when they first met him. "That is the Lord," he said. Peter did not wait for the boat to reach shore. He threw himself into the water and swam. On the beach there was a charcoal fire, fish cooking, bread laid out. A simple breakfast prepared by the risen man for the friends who had abandoned him. And over that meal, a conversation took place between Jesus and Peter. 3 times he asked Peter the same question, "Do you love me?" 3 questions matching the 3 denials, and with each answer, something was healed, something was restored. The failure was not erased, it was redeemed. Each of these encounters was different, each was personal, each left the person transformed in a way that could not be undone, and each pointed back to those 5 events on Friday afternoon: the darkness, the earthquake, the rocks splitting, the curtain tearing, the tombs opening, because those events were not the end of the story. They were the beginning. Now we stand at a distance and look at these 5 events together, not as isolated phenomena, but as a sequence, a pattern, a message written not in words, but in the language of the physical world itself. The first event was darkness. The light of the world withdrew. The sun, which had risen that morning as it had every morning since creation, hid its face. The ancient prophets had warned of such a day when the light would fail and the earth would mourn. For 3 hours, the world experienced what the absence of light feels like. Not the gentle darkness of evening, which comes gradually and is expected, but the sudden, oppressive darkness of midday, which is neither expected nor natural. This was the sign of mourning, the cosmos itself bearing witness to a death that was not merely human. The second event was the earthquake. The ground that had been stable and reliable since the foundations of the world were laid now shook. The permanence of the earth, the one thing that every person takes for granted, the solid ground beneath their feet, was revealed to be less permanent than they thought. Something was happening that affected not just the surface of events, but the foundations of reality. This was the sign of disruption. The old order was being shaken. The third event was the splitting of the rocks. Stone, the symbol of permanence and immovability, broke open. The hardest, most resistant material in the natural world yielded to a force greater than itself. What had been sealed was opened. What had been whole was fractured. The image is one of something breaking free from the inside, as if the rock could no longer contain what was within it. This was the sign of release. Something that had been locked up was breaking out. The fourth event was the tearing of the curtain. The boundary between God and humanity, the physical manifestation of the theological principle that holiness and ordinariness cannot coexist, was destroyed. Not from the bottom up, as human effort would have achieved, but from the top down, as only divine action could accomplish. The barrier was removed. Access was granted. The most restricted space in the religious world was thrown open. This was the sign of access. The separation between the divine and the human was ended. The fifth event was the opening of the tombs. The boundary between death and life, the most fundamental and universal boundary in all of human experience, was breached. The dead were seen among the living. The one-way passage from life to death was shown to have, at least for that moment, a return direction. The graves gave back what they had taken. This was the sign of reversal. Death itself was being overturned. 5 events, 5 signs, 1 direction. From darkness to light, from shaking to stability, from imprisonment to freedom, from separation to access, from death to life. Consider what this sequence means if you take it seriously. The first event removed the light. It forced everyone present into a shared experience of blindness, of vulnerability, of not being able to see what was happening around them. For 3 hours, the witnesses were stripped of their primary sense. They could not observe. They could not analyze. They could only feel. And what they felt was the weight of something enormous happening in the dark. The second event removed the ground. The one thing every person relies on without thinking, the solid earth beneath their feet, was shown to be less stable than they assumed. The earthquake did not just move rocks, it moved certainty. It shook the unconscious assumption that the world is fixed, permanent, and predictable. After the ground moves, you never quite trust it the same way again. The third event removed the barriers within nature itself. Rock, the hardest and most resistant substance in the natural world, yielded, split, cracked open. Whatever was happening was not confined to the surface of events. It was reaching down into the deepest, most resistant layers of the physical world and breaking them apart from the inside. The fourth event removed the barrier between God and humanity. The curtain, that ancient, thick, carefully maintained boundary between the holy and the ordinary, was destroyed in a single moment. Not by human hands, not by decay or neglect, but by a force that came from above and tore downward. Whatever had been accomplished on that cross had consequences that reached into the very structure of how God and humans relate to each other. The fifth event removed the barrier between life and death. The most final, most universal, most inescapable boundary in human experience was shown to be, at least for that moment, penetrable. The dead were among the living. The graves gave back what they had taken. The one thing that every person fears, the one reality that no amount of wealth or power or cleverness can overcome, was overturned. 5 barriers, 5 removals. The barrier of sight, the barrier of certainty, the barrier of nature, the barrier of holiness, the barrier of death. Each one stripped away, each one shown to be temporary rather than permanent, conditional rather than absolute. And at the center of all 5, a single point of origin: the death of one man on a cross. The ancient world understood that significance is revealed through signs, not through arguments, not through philosophical propositions, but through events that carry meaning in their very structure. The darkness at midday did not need to be interpreted. It communicated directly to the body and the senses that something was wrong with the world. The earthquake did not need a theological explanation. Every person who felt the ground shake understood instinctively that the foundations were being disturbed. These 5 events were not random disruptions of nature. They were a language, and the message they spoke was clear to those who had ears to hear it. Something has ended, and something has begun. The events of that Friday did not stay in Jerusalem. They could not. Events of that magnitude do not stay contained. They ripple outward like the shock waves of the earthquake itself, moving through communities and conversations and generations, gaining momentum with every retelling. Within weeks, the followers of Jesus, who had scattered in terror on the night of the arrest, were standing in public, in the same city, before the same authorities,
proclaiming that the one who died had risen. They pointed to the 5 events as evidence: the darkness, the earthquake, the torn curtain, the opened tombs, the empty tomb on the 3rd day. They did not present these as metaphors. They presented them as facts, things that happened, things that people saw, things that could be verified by any citizen of Jerusalem who had been present that afternoon. And this is important. The earliest proclamation happened in the same city where the events occurred, before witnesses who had been there, before authorities who had access to records, to soldiers, to the sealed tomb itself. If the events had not happened, if the darkness was fabricated, if the earthquake was invented, if the torn curtain was a story, then the movement could have been stopped immediately. A single official denial, backed by eyewitness contradictions, would have been enough. Instead, the movement grew, not because it was easy, not because it was safe. The earliest followers were arrested. They were beaten. They were threatened. Some were killed. James, the brother of John, was executed by Herod Agrippa within a decade of the crucifixion. Stephen was stoned to death even earlier. Paul, who had initially been one of the most aggressive persecutors of the movement, was himself imprisoned, beaten, shipwrecked, and eventually, according to tradition, executed in Rome. People do not endure these things for a story they know to be false. And the world did change. Not immediately, not completely, not without resistance and persecution and doubt and debate. But the story spread from Jerusalem to Judea, from Judea to Samaria, from Samaria to Antioch, to Ephesus, to Corinth, to Rome itself. Within a generation, communities devoted to this story existed in every major city of the empire. Within 3 centuries, the empire itself had adopted it. The 5 events of that Friday afternoon were told and retold, written and rewritten, interpreted and reinterpreted. Each generation found new meaning in them. Each culture brought its own questions. Each individual heard them differently. Scholars debated the nature of the darkness. Scientists examined the geological records for earthquake activity. Architects studied the construction of the temple curtain. Archaeologists searched for evidence of the opened tombs. But the events themselves remained, stubborn, unresolvable, resistant to easy explanation. Because when the sky goes dark at noon, and the earth shakes, and the rocks split, and the curtain tears, and the dead walk among the living, these are not the kinds of things that can be filed away in a drawer and forgotten. They demand a response. Not necessarily belief, not necessarily acceptance of any particular theological framework, but attention. Serious, sustained, honest attention to the question of what happened on that afternoon, in that city, at the foot of that cross. We return now to where we began, a Friday afternoon, a city in turmoil, an execution on a hill, and 5 events that should not have happened. The darkness which turned midday into midnight, the earthquake which shook the foundations of the city, the rocks which split open as if broken from within, the curtain which tore from top to bottom, and the tombs which gave back the dead to the living. Each of these events carries its own weight. Each raises its own questions. Each resists simple explanation.
but together they form a pattern that is harder to dismiss than any single element. Because coincidence has limits. One unusual event is a curiosity. Two is a coincidence. Three is a pattern. Five, occurring simultaneously at the precise moment of a specific death, in direct response, or so every witness believed, to that death. That is something else entirely. What it is exactly is the question that remains. After 2,000 years of study, debate, belief, and disbelief, the question has not been resolved, and perhaps it cannot be. Perhaps these events exist at precisely the boundary where history and mystery meet, where evidence reaches its limit and something else must take over. The ancient witnesses did not have the luxury of 2,000 years of distance. They were standing in the rubble, breathing the dust, watching the sky clear after 3 hours of impossible darkness, feeling the aftershocks of the earthquake still trembling through their legs. They did not have time to construct theories. They had only their senses, their memories, and the overwhelming experience of having witnessed something that did not fit any category they possessed. And yet, they did something remarkable. They remembered, carefully, precisely, in detail. They preserved the sequence of events, the darkness first, then the death, then the earthquake, then the splitting of the rocks, then the torn curtain, then the opened tombs, with a specificity that suggests not invention, but traumatic memory. The kind of memory that is seared into the brain by the intensity of the experience. The kind of memory that does not fade or blur with time, but remains sharp and clear decades later. This is not the pattern of legend. Legends smooth. Legends generalize. Legends grow more dramatic over time. What we find in these accounts is the opposite. Specific details, precise timing, multiple perspectives that do not perfectly harmonize, which is itself a sign of authentic testimony, because coordinated fabrication produces smooth, consistent stories, while genuine eyewitness accounts produce the rough, overlapping, slightly contradictory narratives that we actually find. Faith, perhaps, or wonder, or simply the willingness to sit with an unanswered question and let it do its work. Because the 5 events of that Friday afternoon are not demanding that you believe. They are demanding that you notice, that you stop, that you look at what happened, and that you ask yourself, honestly, quietly, without pressure or pretense, what it means. The darkness has lifted. The ground has settled. The rocks are still split. The curtain is still torn. And the tomb, that borrowed, sealed, guarded tomb in the garden, is still empty. The question remains, and it is still worth asking. If this story left something in you that was not there before, a question, a thought, a sense that these events deserve more than a passing glance, then you understand why Sacred Psalms exists. This channel is dedicated to exploring the deepest, most mysterious, most challenging passages in the ancient scriptures, not with simple answers, not with easy certainty, but with the patience and depth that these texts deserve. If that matters to you, subscribe. It is the simplest way to join us on this journey. More documentaries are coming, lost texts, forgotten prophecies, ancient mysteries that most people have never heard of. If you want to go further, consider becoming a member of the channel. Members receive access to extended content, exclusive documentaries, and a community of people who take these questions as seriously as you do. And if this video meant something to you, if it genuinely made you think,
then a super thanks is one of the most meaningful ways to say so. It tells us that this work matters, that depth has an audience, that the ancient texts still have power. Thank you for being here until the end. And one last question. Which of the 5 events struck you the most? The darkness, the earthquake, the torn curtain, the opened tombs, or the empty grave on Sunday morning? Tell us in the comments, because after 2,000 years, this conversation is far from over.